I find that when I sometimes talk with the burglars, which is always fun, but I find that the people are so interested in the details of how the break-in occurred and then what did they do, that we sometimes don't remember to talk about why they were doing this and what the FBI was like before. And I can't really expect people in most audiences to remember what J. Edgar Hoover was doing prior to 43 years ago and what inspired the burglars to do this. It's almost hard to imagine, I think, in today's world that someone could, a public official could be an icon in the way that Hoover was. There were people in various movements, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, who thought that there were that the FBI was spying on their movements and that the FBI wanted to suppress dissent. But as far as the American public as a whole was concerned, J. Edgar Hoover was enormously admired, in some polls more popular than some presidents. And in fact, he at one time considered running for president. He had been appointed to the FBI as FBI director in 1924 at age 29, which is also a rather striking fact, hard for anyone to imagine, and the fact that he then served for a half century. He died in 1972, a little more than a year after the media burglary. I guess it's important also to understand that there was absolutely no oversight of the FBI. There were no committees in Congress that assumed any kind of oversight for the FBI. Attorney generals, who were technically his boss, usually treated him as though he was their boss, which is the way he wanted it. And presidents also paid little attention to him. And while the public had no inkling that there was a secret FBI that sort of dominated his daily life and the life of many agents, there were people in power who did have some idea of that. They had an inkling that there were files about people's personal lives and feared that they were about their lives. And so that was one of the reasons why he got a pass at the highest level of official Washington. There's a historian, Richard Powers, who has written a few books on the FBI. And I think this, from him, really sums up the source of Hoover's power extremely well. He said, Hoover's power to conduct secret operations depended on the absolute freedom he had from any inquiry into the internal operations of the Bureau. It had been that luxury of freedom let him indulge himself with such abuses of power as his persecution of King, the COINTELPROs, and his harassment of Bureau critics. On the night of March 8, 1971, that changed forever. A group calling itself the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into the resident agency in Media, Pennsylvania. The burglars were never caught. And before I talk about the burglars, I'd just like to also point out one thing. I mentioned about the no oversight. I should also add that there also was no oversight by journalists. The FBI was reported on almost not at all. But the only reporter who had done significant investigative work on the FBI at that time until that time, was Jack Nelson. And Jack Nelson was then in the Washington Bureau of the Los Angeles Times. And something significant about Jack that I didn't learn until I did the investigation for this book was that at that very time, as a result of a book that he had written the previous year called The Orangeburg Massacre, at that very time, in 1971, Hoover was working furiously to try to get Jack Nelson fired from the LA Times. And this may explain why there was so little journalism done about J. Edgar Hoover. Tom Wicker, a columnist at the New York Times, occasionally did commentary, but as far as investigative reporting, Jack was just about the only person. As Gene said, the burglars were pursued by 200 agents who were on this case, most of them in the Philadelphia area, New Jersey, but actually the investigation took place all over the country. And suddenly, all those photographs, thousands of photographs that had been taken at anti-war demonstrations, civil rights activities, those photos were asked for, and they poured into the Philadelphia and Washington offices and to look for suspects. I'd like to introduce you to the burglars. There were 8 people. 5 of them became known 2 months ago on the day when my book was published. And they're also in a documentary that I'm sure will come to Washington sometime. It's going to premiere in April at the Tribeca Film Festival. It's called 1971. It's really the work of one person, the thoughts of one person, and the commitment of one person who is responsible for the fact that this happened. And that's Bill Davidon. Bill Davidon was a physics professor. He had been at Haverford College teaching since 1961. And he was a Navy veteran, but he had become a pacifist after Hiroshima and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And his activism at first was completely focused on anti-nuclear efforts. He began to realize by the end of 1969 the great sense of hopelessness and futility that existed in the peace movement. And although he was an optimistic type himself, he had difficulty beginning then to find hope, because the war had been going on for so long. And he couldn't see any end in sight. Officials seemed to be ignoring evidence and questions that were presented to them. The peace movement was pretty large in Philadelphia, and he belonged to various segments of it, the scientific segments of it, the campus parts of it, and the Catholic peace movement. And one thing that he did was part of a group called the Resistance, a very large umbrella group in the Philadelphia peace movement. And that's where he found some of his most gratifying experiences, where he spent times on coffee houses, on military bases, listening to active duty soldiers and talking to them about the war and offering them opportunities to resist if they changed their minds. In the beginning of 1970, more and more, as he went from one part of the peace movement to another in Philadelphia, he kept hearing people talk about what to many of them was a new problem, but a fairly serious one. And that was that they thought there were spies in their midst. And he didn't believe it. He rejected it. And by both personality and scientific training, he really hated conspiracies. And he thought that people were just so disappointed that they were despairing and imagining possibly that there were spies in their midst. But he kept listening, and he kept hearing it more and more, including from very reasonable people. And he thought that this was a problem so serious that it needed to be solved. What do you do when you think that the FBI director, led by the most powerful official in the country in many ways, is responsible for the suppression of dissent? Most people certainly, I think, if they had that insight or come to that conclusion, they would have thought, well, this is really awful and it's too bad, but I don't see what I can do about it, certainly. And that was not the way Bill Davidon worked. When he saw a problem, he tried to figure out a way to solve it, including this one. And he had some idea of what Hoover's personality was like from what he had read, and he thought that he was a consummate bureaucrat, and that probably meant that he kept greatly detailed records and required everyone else to do so too. And that led him to think that if there was a great amount of political suppression taking place, that too would be documented. And if that were the case, there was evidence. And it ought to be possible to get that evidence, even, he decided, if it could not be officially compelled. So by the end of 1970, he had decided that it was very important to solve this. And because in the previous year, I think beginning in late 69, he had participated in the Catholic peace movement in the raid on draft boards, where they had removed files in the night and actually destroyed them in the hope that they could have an impact on slowing down the draft boards that they raided. And they chose draft boards that were in the neighborhoods of poor Black communities or working class white communities where they thought there was a disproportionate number of people being drafted. So as he thought about how to get the evidence to prove whether or not Hoover was suppressing dissent, eventually burglary came to mind. And he considered it repugnant, just as he did when he first heard about it from the Catholic left. But he decided that there was probably no legal way at that time that you could get information about Hoover's FBI. And if you were to find evidence, you would have to break in.